Savior say, thy strength indeed is small. Child of weakness, watch and pray. Find in me thine all in all. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Lord, now indeed I find thy power and thine alone can change the leper's spots and melt the heart of stone. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. The throne I stand in incomplete. Jesus died my soul to save, and my lips shall still repeat. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Oh, well, sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow.
Hi guys, scripture reading today is going to be from Psalm 85, and then we're going to get into Leviticus chapter 26. We're going to close our brief jaunt through Leviticus with chapter 26. But first, scripture reading, Psalm 85. Lord, you were favorable to your land. You restored the fortunes of Jacob. You forgave the iniquity of your people. You covered all their sin. You withdrew all your wrath. You turned from your hot anger. Restore us again, O God of our salvation, and put away your indignation toward us. Will you be angry with us forever? Will you prolong your anger to all generations? Will you not revive us again, that your people may rejoice in you? Show us your steadfast love, O Lord, and grant us your salvation. Let me hear what God, the Lord, will speak. For he will speak peace to his people, to his saints, but let them not turn back to folly. Surely his salvation is near to those who fear him, that glory may dwell in our land. Steadfast love and faithfulness meet. Righteousness and peace kiss each other. Faithfulness springs up from the ground, and righteousness looks down from the sky. Yes, the Lord will give what is good, and the land will yield its increase. Righteousness will go before him and make his footsteps a way. Amen. So to Leviticus 26, this is commonly just laid out in terms of the series of blessings and cursings for keeping the covenant or failing to do so. We'll talk more about that going forward. But what you do have at the end of chapter 25, in this great Jubilee year, this great sort of peak of the Jubilee in chapter 25, which presents a bit of a picture of the land at rest, the people living in abundance in the land. It is, as we said last time, this sort of ultimate Sabbath rest that God, through this whole tabernacle system, has gifted to the people. He's given it to them as a sort of return to an Eden-like existence where they are all living harmoniously with each other. They are living at peace in the land, in security. They are living, interestingly, in there in chapter 25, if you read through it, they're actually at peace with the wild beasts, the animals, which is not only reminiscent of Genesis when mankind lived at peace with the animals, but is evocative later in prophets like Isaiah, who talk about the messianic era, the age to come, being characterized by peace with wild animals. So all this really seems to be the picture of the Jubilee. And then coming off of that, chapter 26 picks up that picture. It will be put in terms of, starting in verse 3, if you walk in my statutes. And then there are a bunch of blessings detailed that just sort of carry over from the Jubilee blessing. That is to say, the rain coming down and the land producing food in abundance, peace in the land, again, both with the animals and humanity, but also a sort of national security, that their enemies wouldn't be able to attack them and overtake them. In fact, it would be quite the opposite. They would themselves, the people would be blessed to be able to proliferate their families. They would multiply abundantly, and they would be blessed in material prosperity. And then finally you get to verse 11. In one sense, it's the climax. In another sense, it's just the reiteration of what this whole program's really been about, which is to say God's presence in their midst is a part of this promise, a part of these blessings. So the whole thing it's a familiar layout actually in the ancient world. If you walk in my statutes, here are all these benefits that accrue. It's interesting, the blessings are all laid out rather concisely. They're nice and concise. And then the curses, as they're often called, are extensive, they outnumber the blessings by many, many more verses. And they're given with much more detail. The blessings are general. You have 4 major categories, and it's all just good. There's nothing, it's all good. And then all the curses, the warnings and admonitions that we come to, are in much more specific detail, and they just go on and on and on. And that causes people a lot of difficulty reading this. It seems there's something wrong with that. There's actually a few good reasons for that. We won't go into all of them, but just in terms of the layout, here are the blessings for obedience, and here is what happens if you disobey. This is pretty familiar stuff in the ancient world. What's happening here is basically what it looks like when you have a vassal treaty being worked out, about what they call a suzerain arrangement. So to enumerate the terms of the treaty, it's a contract basically. So it's a familiar form in the ancient world, and this section happens to be bracketed, importantly, in verse 3 and then again in verse 13, by 2 mentions of the word walk. halak in Hebrew, if you walk in my statutes. And then verse 13, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. This is another sort of function of the vassal treaty arrangement. This is assigning the parties and their responsibilities, and then the relationship between the two. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their slaves. Part of that is Yahweh telling his people, I took you to be my slaves. You're my servants. This is the arrangement now. And I have broken the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. So you enter, as we talked about last time, you enter out from the bondage of one master and into the service of another. But here the contrast, under the first master, who was Egypt, they are pictured as beasts of burden under a yoke. And you can see God just breaking that so that they can literally lift their heads up high. They can walk uprightly. So it's a master. You're coming under a new master and you are slaves to him. But there is, even in the picture of that transfer, a freedom. So this whole thing picks up the importance of this Hebrew word, if you walk. And here's how you'll walk. And I will make you, I will allow you, I will give to you, that you can now walk heads high. So that's a sort of bracketing feature of the first 13 verses. Just to highlight a couple points within that section, we won't go into any great detail, but in verse 8, when you have this promise that 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you will chase 10,000, and your enemies will fall before you by the sword, he not only provides for security in their land from invading foreign armies, but they then will be the sort of aggressor in battle. They will be able to so effectively wage battles in the interest of national security and self-defense that it would only take 5 of them to chase off 100. But what's interesting here is the way the math works, right? 5 chasing away 100 is not the same percentage as 100 chasing 10,000 off. And so there's an interesting rabbinic commentary on this that notes that there's a discrepancy in the ratios here. As you get more faithful believers in obedience to the covenant, just numerically, their strength exponentially increases. There's a little bit of an embedded lesson here in the effect of having some faithful believers is good. It's strong. Obedience and faithfulness and unity lead to strength. But having more of them is better. And it's not just better like commensurate with the small group. It's exponentially better. You don't just get stronger in overall terms. Your strength increases as a percentage of the people. So there's an interesting little lesson built into here that the rabbis pick up, that the more of God's people are obedient to his word, the more strength, not just overall, but even as a percentage, the more strength we garner to be able to fight the enemy. Our efforts there are amplified, if you will. So that's an interesting little detail. Verse 9, the promise to make the people fruitful and multiply them, that is tying the covenant obedience here for the people back to the covenant with Abraham. This is language that God said to Abraham, I will make you fruitful, I will cause you to multiply. Your descendants shall be as the sand of the sea and the stars of the sky, etc. So this is tying the story of Israel in the land back to Abraham, through whom the original covenant was made and that promise was given. It also precedes that, the way the language is set up here, goes back to Noah. Right? This is almost identical to what God told Noah. It's actually a command to Noah, go and be fruitful and multiply. That commandment to Noah is picking up the very first command in the Bible to Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. So what you have here is through the use of these sort of buzzwords, if you will, something that is going to appear throughout the biblical story in conjunction with various figures. It's every time you hear this language, be fruitful and multiply, it should be a signal that something important, going all the way back to the beginning of the story, is being recapitulated. It's being reintroduced, and there's something that we need to take there. It's almost always tied to covenant and calling, to God's blessing on His people, but also what He's going to use them for in their mission. So all this really rings out when you hear these little buzzwords like "be fruitful and multiply." It's sort of like you learn to read the Bible this way. If you tune into these grammatical cues, if you will, and we're going to have a grammar-heavy teaching today, so apologize for that. Some of you love it. Some of you will be a little bit dizzied by it. But one of these cases where the more you can tune into the way biblical words are used, biblical phrases, and the grammar and the language start to work, it's something like a musical tune, a score that arises. Think of a film score. Think of movies that you watch. When you hear "be fruitful and multiply," if you're an attuned biblical reader and you know the story front to back, you're going to start to think, hey, wait a minute, this isn't just a random commandment or a random promise or blessing. This is something specific. This is something that's situated in the broader story for a reason. It must be rising back up from the story here for a reason. So think of like a movie. You watch movies, and I'll spare us all the ignominy of doing it. But if you hear the tune, right, from certain sort of well-known classic movies, think of Star Wars, right? Best example, probably John Williams' score. You hear, and you could sing both of them right off the bat. Dun 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 dun. You know immediately, just if you've watched the movie enough times, it comes to mind. In fact, before you get too deep into the movie for the first time, you start to know. You have an idea of what's going to come next. You know who you're going to see. You know what part of the story is going to happen now. Something dark and malignant and evil is about to arise in the story, right? That's the Vader theme, the Death Star. Whereas in contrast to that, you have the I don't know, what is it, the Skywalker theme. You have, as soon as you hear the notes, as soon as you hear the tune arising within the story, the music itself sends a signal. You're already emotionally investing before you see what's coming. The grammar here does something like that, or the language does something like that. So be fruitful and multiply. You think Abraham, you think Noah, you think Adam's original calling to go and spread God's life and to go and participate in His creation as His image. All this is rolling forward. And so Israel here, with these blessings, are being called back to that same ministry, that same mission, that same service to God, to bear His name and to carry His life and His love into the world. So this is an important theme. It comes out in little details like this. And this leads right into verse 11, which God says, I will make my dwelling among you, or I will make my tabernacle among you. You can take this as a promise of the temple. Right? The Solomon's temple will be built. It can easily read that way. But a lot of scholars see this as, I will just cause my presence to be with you, which is not too big of a distinction if you understand the theology of the temple there. Even if he's talking about the temple, the point of the temple was, as the tabernacle, for God's presence to be there. So the idea here is the personal presence of God Himself is not just one of the blessings that accompanies obedience to the covenant. It seems to be the culminating blessing. In some ways, it is the point of all the rest of it. To that point, when you look at verse 12, and this is something I really want to drill down on a little bit here. Verse 12, I will also walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. This is an important sort of key word here. As I said, the section of blessings is bracketed by, if you walk in my statutes, and I will cause you to walk erect. That halak, walk language, is bracketing this whole section. Here in verse 12, you have the same thing, but only here it is God who will walk. I will walk among you. But here it is a relatively rare form of the Hebrew word halak, hithalak. Hithalak is in what they call the hitpl form. Again, sorry for the grammar outburst, but it's going to be relevant here. First of all, a lot of scholars prefer to think of the idea of, in this sense of walking among you, as something like a casual stroll. I will stroll among you. Go for a walk. That's helpful. But the hitpl here, the particular form of the verb, first of all, again, like that film score, just like be fruitful and multiply, it's going to connect back quite directly, it seems, with Genesis 3. It's the very same sort of language that God uses in the garden when he comes to walk with Adam and Eve, when he is walking in the garden there. And there you will get to something very specific. He is seeking them out to walk with them. The same, not just the same word here, but it's the same form, rather rare form of the word, which often in most of the time a hitpl has the function of, it makes the verb what they call reflexive. So it's an action you're doing upon yourself. I got dressed. I dressed myself. That would be a reflexive form. But it can also be used, and it seems here more appropriately, both in the garden story and I'm going to suggest here in Leviticus, to be a signaling mutual action. So I could say, I got coffee this morning. And you could take that as reflexive. I got myself some coffee. Or in a different context, I could say, I got coffee, but what I meant was I met my wife for coffee. I sat down with my wife to have coffee. Same form. You could use the same form of the verb there, but it would be a mutual action. We were meeting for coffee together. It was a mutual action that we both did individually, but it formed a unity. That seems to be the appropriate way to see this here. I will hithalak among you. I will walk among you. He's looking for mutuality. He's looking for participation. As in the garden, when he goes looking for Adam and Eve, he comes to hithalak. He comes to walk in their midst. He comes to participate with them in a mutual way. That heightens the tragedy. When you go back to the story there, verse 8, they heard the sound of the Lord God, hithalek, walking in the garden with them, the cool of the day. That is, he comes to walk with them. But we already know from the story, if you're reading the story, you know, they have already created a problem. When he comes to walk, they're hiding. And so then when you hear God's call to them, back in Genesis 3, verse 9, when he calls to the man and he says to them, where are you? When you see this intention that God would come and walk mutually with them, participate in this walk together, that knowing that they're already separated from him, knowing that they've already disobeyed and now are separated and in fact hiding themselves from his presence, that really makes the tragedy much more acute. Where are you is not, where are you located? I would like to know. He's not seeking information. It's in fact something more evocative. It's why didn't you show up? Right? We had an appointment. We had a walk together planned. We were supposed to do this hitalak. We were supposed to be walking together. And it's already been, the plan has already been abandoned by humanity. They stood God up. And so, where are you becomes an expression of someone who's been jilted, someone who's lamenting the fact that this that was supposed to happen can no longer happen. In fact, the call, where are you? The way that's worded in Hebrew, it's ayacha. It's what's going on. Is sort of the call. The way the word is spelled is basically identical to the opening verse, opening word, which is also the title for the book of Lamentations. Eicha. When Lamentations begins, how lonely sits the city. It's an expression of interrogation. It's a question, which is why they frame it that way, why they translate it that way. But what you could be asking there is, what's happening? What has happened to the city, right, that sits alone? What has happened to the covenant people, to the covenant nation? What has happened that all this calamity has befallen us? It's nearly identical language. So God says to Adam, Ayaka, where are you? What he means is, what's happening? What happened? What's going on? It's his way of lamenting. This is what David, for instance, writes in Psalm 42. As with a deadly wound in my bones, my adversaries taunt me, while they say to me all the day long, where is your God? Same phrase, same word in Hebrew. Ayaha, where is he? They don't mean we would like to find the location of your God. They mean, what happened to him? Wasn't he supposed to protect you? Wasn't he supposed to keep you? Wasn't he supposed to be here for you? What happened? And they're using it as a taunt. God uses it as a lament. What happened here? Where have you gone? So he's lamenting the loss, the tragic loss of this opportunity for a relationship with his people. And the way these connections work is when you read Leviticus and you see this hitalak pop up, walking together. I will stroll with you. I will mutually walk together with you. And then you connect that back to Genesis. That's going to do two things. It's going to help Leviticus, as you read it, explain Genesis. It sheds light back on that story. But it also helps to bring Genesis forward into Leviticus, where what you have here in God's promises, I will put my dwelling among you, I will be with you with my presence, my tabernacle will be in your midst, and I will walk with you. That is bringing the story of Genesis back into Leviticus and saying, in effect, we got another chance at this. What Adam and Eve failed to find when God came to walk with them, what they could not do, which is what he wanted to do. The implication here is that for the people of the tabernacle, for the people who revere the sanctuary and the Sabbath and walk with God in this whole system that he set up, there's another chance to walk with him. He's restoring that possibility. It is, again, in effect, a symbolic return to Eden and to reverse what Adam has undone. So there's really a beautiful picture there in these first 13 verses, which almost makes you not want to keep reading because you know what's coming in verse 14. But if you keep in mind there that Genesis story and the call of God, where are you? What happened? That will help to make more sense of verse 14 and all of these curses that then follow. There's a way to read that these curses that begin in verse 14 may be better to be thought of as admonitions, or their warnings is what they are. If you do this, here's what's going to result. But you might just think of them as consequences, right? Adam and Eve disobey. Right? Adam disobeys God and trusts in his own sort of pride and wisdom to do things his way. And God does not curse him by severing the relationship. God's coming to have the relationship. Adam has chosen the separation. He has chosen to follow his own path, and now God is separated from him. That is a consequence of what Adam did. But you wouldn't read that and say, well, it's the curse put upon Adam. That curse, the curse idea doesn't even come until later in the Genesis story there in Genesis 3, and it's not specifically laid at that part of the relationship with Adam. Adam will live under a curse, but that separation from God is just more naturally the consequence of his choice. And it may be better to read this section of Leviticus in that way. What the people will choose to obey or to disobey, to walk with him or to walk their own way, will just lead to consequences that will result in them not just being separate from God and his presence, but enduring all of these calamities. That is to say, they're not simply punishments. There is a punitive aspect to a lot of this, for sure. I wouldn't want to minimize that. But they are not merely punitive. They're exiled from the land, not just because God's angry, but we know this from later in the chapter. Part of the purpose of the exile is to give the land a chance to rest and regain the Sabbaths that they had lost under mankind's failure to give them the rest that they were supposed to have. So that's not strictly punitive against the humans who get kicked out of the land. That's also sort of redemptive, has a purpose to it, for the land to be able to rest. It's very useful to see these warnings as warnings against not how God will punish us, in his meanness because he's angry at us. To be sure, there is some of that. But probably better to think of it as a loving father disciplines his children. So part of the way he'll do that is let them live with the results of their own choices. And that seems to be, just again, from a 30,000-foot view, if you step back, that's, I think, the more accurate way to read this whole section. Now, that's not to take the sting out of it or try to make it sound like it's nicer than it is. This is horrifying. What will unfold in the rest of this chapter is largely just a horror show of calamity and hardship. Some of them so terrible you don't even want to get into any great detail. But in all of this, it's important to keep in mind that mutual relationship that God wanted with them, that he uses this concept of walking with them to describe, that's going to permeate the entire thread. That's going to be a thread that permeates this entire chapter in terms of giving it the perspective you're going to have on it. So how the people choose to walk will determine whether or not they walk with God. I think that's important to keep in mind, that whatever we want to say about God's punishments, his discipline, his correction, how he works to control events and bring them to pass, and for what purposes, however we're going to talk about that, it is important to keep in mind this picture of the God who desires a relationship with his people and their choices severing that tie. Verse 21, you start to read about, and this is translated variously, but usually something like, if you walk contrary to me, or NASB says, if you act with hostility to me. That's again a reiteration of that word halak, if you walk, and the Hebrew word that follows it up is keri. If you walk keri to me. It's interesting how this word works throughout the Hebrew Bible. And this may shed light in an interesting way on all that's going on here in these curses. It comes from a verbal root. We've talked about this a few weeks ago with mikra, the holy convocations, proclamation. A mikra is a proclamation. I mentioned at the time there is something very closely related in the Hebrew sound, mikre. But a mikre is just an occurrence, usually picking up the connotation of happenstance, something that just by chance happens to be or happens to become. It's a chance encounter. This word is at play here when God says, if you walk keri, that is, you might think of this, hostility is basically correct. A lot of times in the Bible, what you have is, a couple times you have encounters where someone is going about their business and someone else encounters them and does harm to them, right? So you'd have this chance encounter, like an ambush, if you will. It wasn't predictable. It was just an occasion that befell a person. And the result was they got hurt. When God says, if you walk contrary to me, or if you walk with hostility, that's picking that up. But it also has implicit in it the idea of a random occurrence, right? Which doesn't really describe God very well. So when he says, if you walk contrary to me, if you walk with me, keri, then I will walk contrary to you. It doesn't just mean if you oppose me, I will oppose you. It's certainly that's the result. That's what we're looking at in the big picture here. But given the way this word operates and picks up that nuance of a chance encounter, what he seems to be getting at here is the attitude that, hey, we have all these blessings in the land, we have all these promises that God's given us, but if we begin to treat that in the attitude of our hearts like, well, it's nice that we have this, it's nice that we happen to have all this stuff, right? This is a fortunate turn of events that we ended up with all these blessings. If that's the way you start to act toward me, that is to say, you walk keri, you treat it as if it were merely happenstance that God has given us all this. And you lose that sense of providence, that he has provided everything you have here. that is an act of open hostility. And so he will respond in kind, which is to say he will become hostile, but it is also to say he will give you the opportunity to just live life as if you're in a random series of chance encounters. It is precisely the language of Ecclesiastes 9. This is Kohelet's view. Solomon writes, the race is not to the swift, etc., but time and chance overtake them all, happen to them all. Time and chance carry everybody. They just happen to come upon everybody. In a fallen world, this is the reflection of Kohelet. Under the sun is his language there. He has intentionally removed the conversation from the covenant blessings and the covenant community. He has intentionally left that out of the conversation, and he's just reflecting on life outside of God's covenant blessings. And in that context, he reflects there that everybody in a mortal state will have time and chance simply happen to them at one point or another. And ultimately, that is what overtakes all of us. Time will be the great ender, the great equalizer of everybody. It will just occur someday that your time will run out. He intentionally has removed it from any covenant context. That's his whole conversation there is life in the fall, removed from God's covenant blessings. And that seems to be precisely what the people of Israel here are being challenged with. The temptation is to say, we are in the covenant bubble. We are in the Edenic covenant blessed state if we walk in obedience. But if we choose to remove ourselves from that protection, we go out into a life of carry, a life of happenstance, a life of just random occurrences. You choose the chaos, God gives you the chaos. That's not to say that out in a fallen world or to unbelievers outside of God's people, that he is no longer governing affairs, that he's no longer able to work in those places. Of course, it's not to say that everything out there is meaningless. But it is to say that there is a freedom to move out there that subjects you to random things happening. So this gets into much deeper questions that we'd have to ponder and discuss in more detail in another study. But it's interesting to think about the way this is framed here. These curses, in other words, are the flip side of a life of order and peace and protection in God's covenant, in his community, living under his promises, with him in your midst, walking among you. In other words, if he's not providing any of that, it is not because he decided not to anymore. It's because we volitionally chose to go out where we kind of want things to we already see these blessings that God's given us as just kind of random. We happen to have them. That's already the wrong attitude. And enough of that, if that's your worldview, God says, go have your worldview. And now you're going to be subject to a world where things do just happen to you sometimes, and they don't make sense, and they are unpredictable. And this is true in the realm of both human behavior and nature. We should know this well in the middle of a global pandemic. Like, there's a natural disease rampant on the earth right now that is hard to find a tight explanation for. And I know I know there are a lot of people who like to talk about with certainty why God is doing this or that. And this gets into a real paradox of discussion. On the one hand, there's a danger in a theology that makes God the cause of every single event in human behavior and in the natural world. There are unexplained occurrences. There are things that just happen. This is a fallen world after all. Once Adam and Eve, by their own choice, subjected the world to death and decay and chaos, that means God is not determining everything that happens. And there's a sort of danger to the theology that says he is causing everything that happens, a sort of determinism. It's not to say, however, that everything that happens nothing happens outside of God's oversight. That's true. He is still in control of everything in the sense that he could intervene at any time, and sometimes, and maybe often, does. So we can't choose one over the other and say, well, either he's all involved or he never is. So this becomes a bit of a line that we have to walk. But the flip side of all that is Leviticus 26, when we say we don't think he's involved at all in any of the good or the bad. We just think it's nice that we happen to have this stuff. That is not an acceptable attitude for God's people. Not that there's no truth to that in a fallen world. It's that the way God's people think about things cannot be to blame him for every terrible thing that happens, but it must be to give him the credit due when he is manifestly working in our lives, when he is using things that are happening. We shouldn't ascribe that just to, I'm glad that worked out, it was fortunate that it did. Right? We have to be careful about this. And that seems to be, I think, the thrust, the sort of thread weaving chapter 26 together. Life is not simply happening to God's people. There is a purpose involved in what is happening. That is not to say that God's controlling every detail, but it is to say our attitude must be that he's at work here. Which does get uncomfortable when you start reading through again these warnings of what's going to happen in the realm of disobedience. These hardships that will befall Israel are just terrible. And it's not accurate to say, well, God can't do anything about that. It's true. He's the one who says, I will set my face against you, and here's what's going to happen. So there's a sense in which he's clearly doing this stuff. We have to reckon with that. And before you get too depressed in the fact that, wow, that sounds like a really mean God, you have to follow through to the end of the chapter. In some sense, it may be the last few verses of chapter 26 that are the most important to keep in mind. After all of these curses are laid out, and after God himself says, I will be involved in this, I will set my face against you to do this, I will act with hostility against you. After all of that, here is how he will close the section. Verse 40, but if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers in their treachery that they committed against me, and also in walking contrary to me, walking carry, so that I have walked contrary to them and brought them into the land of their enemies, if their uncircumcised heart is humbled and they make amends for their iniquity, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I will remember my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. But the land shall be abandoned by them to enjoy its Sabbaths, while it lies desolate without them. They shall make amends for their iniquity, because they spurned my rules, and their souls abhorred my statutes. Yet for all that, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not spurn them, neither will I abhor them, so as to destroy them utterly and break my covenant with them. For I am the Lord their God. Remember how this treaty was enacted originally. I am the Lord your God. Here are the terms. That means if you break the terms, here is what results. But he leaves a clause open. He leaves a door open that you can return to the terms of this treaty. You can come back in to the agreement. The walk is still on the appointment. We can walk together still. He wants to walk with his people. He still holds the door open, even after all of this. Even though they abandon him. Even though, as he says, what they did was treacherous. Sin, pride, indifference. You can interpret carry as casualness. If you walk casually with me? No, sorry, that's not an option for God's people. But even after all of that, he gives them over to their choice, their harmful choices, and all the results and the calamity that comes from that. Even after all of that, he keeps the door open. And he says the only conditions here really are humility and repentance. You just humble yourself and you return. And then the door not only is wide open, but the relationship can be restored. Verse 45, I will, for their sake, remember the covenant with their forefathers, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, that I might be their God. I am the Lord. His great desire, in other words, is not that all these harmful things would happen to them just to prove his point. His great desire is that they would come back, have the relationship, and he can be their God in the sense that he always intended this relationship to work. God walking with his people, his presence and glory in their midst, and they, his servants, his representatives, carrying this message out to the rest of the world. Part of the great tragedy of the exile is not just that God's people had to endure these calamities. It's that the rest of the world, the nation, the Gentile nations, who were supposed to be attracted by God's covenant relationship with Israel, no longer had a witness on the earth. So how is God's message going to go forward? There are answers to that. There are deep, penetrating theological and narrative answers to that with David and Isaiah's servant. This whole program does keep going forward despite Israel's disobedience. But the broader point remains intact. For God's people, being called into a covenant relationship means not just walking in unity with God, walking in a personal relationship. It also means bearing his name before the unbelieving world, to show them that he is not a God who leaves us to random occurrences. He is a God who works in and through what does happen to us. We see what is happening as his provision of a providential view. And that is a testimony to the nations, to the unbelieving world as they look on. Their attitude, in fact, by default is that things just randomly occur and then there's nothing that anybody can do about it. That's not the biblical view. And the worldview that we're supposed to not just explain to people, but live for them is one that says, even though we're in a time of unprecedented calamity and difficult hardship and trial, we don't see it all as random. Do we think God is causing every single event? Do we think he's launched this plague as some sort of message? I don't know, maybe not. I tend to think not, but I do think he has a message in it. And I do think how his people act in the midst of that, not blaming him for everything and then using that to wipe our hands of everything and say, well, what God wants to do, he'll do, but rather seeing him as at work in the midst of it. It's not totally random if God is still overseeing it. Our task is to see, not give ourselves over to the attitude of saying, too bad about this random occurrence, but rather, how is God going to work through this? How is God going to meet with us in the midst of it? How will we walk with him even as this chaos is unfolding? And that's the message of Leviticus 26. That's the message that sort of summarizes the book. This whole tabernacle system is set up so that God's people would have a chance to meet with him, walk with him, be in his presence, and then would be equipped to carry this message out to the rest of the world. So that is the sort of summary version of Leviticus 26 and how it fits in the broader context of the rest of Leviticus, how it summarizes it for us and sort of punctuates it, and how it fits into the broader biblical story. Now, there's a lot more to discuss about, how does this go through the rest of the Bible? But we'll save that for later discussions. The real heart of the message for us is just that. Do we walk with God in a way, in the life of trust, even when what we see around us is chaos and curse and hardship? Or do we assume we got a better way? We'll just deal with these random events as we see fit. And that will, in some ways, determine how our relationship with God goes, and it will determine how the unbelieving world responds to the message we're trying to bring. So that's it for today. God bless. Really look forward to seeing you guys soon. We think we're really close to meeting in person. I know you all love watching these videos for extended periods of time, but it'll be better to do this in face to face, in person. And so I look forward to seeing you soon. God bless.